Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of the Alternate History Podcast. The voice that you are listening to right now is one Evan Buck, and in no particular order, I will be announcing the two-seater edition, well, three-seater if you're including the driver, of the A Fork in Time podcast crew today. To my immediate right is Chris Coppola. Chris, do you have something you'd like to say?
Hi, good people. And don't worry, there is a two-seater coming up in this episode later.
Very much so. And then to the right of him is the newest co-host to the team, and that is Kai McAllister.
Hey, it's good to be back for my second episode of the Fork in Time podcast.
Yes. And today we are actually going to be covering a suggested fork from Kai himself. And so I think, without much further ado, I'll let him take the reins from here.
Yes, indeed. So today we are going to be delving into the ill-fated flight of one Rudolf Hess of the Nazi Party fame. So just to get things established, to get everything under the same umbrella, everyone on the same page, we'll just start talking about who Rudolf Hess was. For those who are World War II historians, be that armchair or academic. Rudolf Hess was a very important figure in the Nazi Party. He was one of the early people who was an acolyte of Hitler. Indeed, he actually spent time in prison with Adolf Hitler when he was imprisoned after the Munich Beer Hall Putsch. Rudolf Hess was born in Egypt to wealthy German parents in British-controlled Egypt. This experience actually made Hess somewhat of a rarity amongst Nazi Party leadership, as he was raised under British rule. And so his youth in Egypt left him with a strong admiration for the British Empire, which is germane to our topic today. He was a soldier in World War I. He witnessed a lot of bloody conflict, and he became an acolyte of Hitler, as I said, very early on. I think it was in 1923, or maybe it was even 1920. And he was very dedicated to Hitler. He even helped write parts of
1920. He was at a rally in Munich, and that's what kind of attracted him to Hitler's ideology. And then he spent time with him in prison in Munich in 23.
23 was the putsch where they're both arrested.
Right. Yep. Yes. Thank you. Yeah. So upon Nazi ascension to power in 1933, Rudolf Hess is actually made deputy Führer to Hitler, which is arguably second in command in the Nazi Party. And so he was a very influential and important figure in the Nazi Party. However, as time went on, and especially as war broke out in 1939, Hess's influence began steadily to decline, and other Nazi Party officials, particularly one Martin Bormann, who was Hitler's personal secretary, ended up assuming more and more of the responsibilities of Hess, and Hess became less and less relevant with time. As a result, possibly, Rudolf Hess decided that he was going to essentially go on a mission to achieve peace with the British Empire. And this mission was to take a flight to Scotland. He had been training to fly a Messerschmitt, B-110, BF-110.
Which is how many seats?
Two-seater.
That's where it comes.
Two-seater.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, I was a little confused. My aviation knowledge is not up to par, but that good one. Yes, so he was training with one person named Wilhelm Sturr, and he was training to fly to Scotland. And upon when the date was finally arrived, May 10th, 1941, Rudolf Hess took a flight to Scotland, and his plane.
I think that was May 1940, actually.
Was it May 1940
No, it was
or
41.
1941?
Was it 41?
Yeah. It was 41.
Yeah.
My bad.
So on May 10th, 1941, Rudolf Hess departed from Augsburg, Germany, and he was on a mission to meet with ostensibly the Duke of Hamilton? Yeah, the
So
Duke of
he was going to
Hamilton.
meet with Hamilton. There are two different Hamiltons in Great Britain that he may have been going to meet with. That is still disputed.
Yes. Yeah. So yeah. We'll just say that it was with the Duke of Hamilton in Scotland, just to make things a little bit easier. There's a lot of this episode is fraught with, suspicions, suggestions, possibilities. A lot of this is not actually
Conspiracies.
known. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're establishing a canonical timeline is a bit of a challenge here because we don't actually know who knew what, when, and what the actual intentions were. In any case, he departs from Augsburg on May 10th, 1941, heads to Scotland. His flight is unsuccessful. He ends up crash landing, is arrested by the British, and is essentially held in captivity for the rest of the war. He plays no influence in Nazi Party politics. The British want nothing of him. They arrest him. They do not listen to him. No negotiation on behalf of the German government is had. It's a nothing burger. On this episode,
End
we're going to
episode.
toy with...
Nice.
Yeah. In this episode, we're going to toy with the idea of what if the Hess flight had never happened. And we talked a while before the podcast started about how we're going to make this happen. And that's why I brought up that totally unknown name, Wilhelm Sturr. Wilhelm Sturr is a seasoned pilot. He trained with Rudolf Hess. And at some point, we speculate that Rudolf Hess probably made some remark about what his intentions were and how he was going to negotiate a wonderful peace that was going to end the war. What if Wilhelm Sturr had reported him to the Gestapo? The Gestapo then act to intercept the flight, and the flight never happens. That's what we're going to chew on in this episode. What if the Rudolf Hess flight never took place?
Yeah. Well, thank you for setting up that fork, Kai. I think you did a really good job on that. I do think that just kind of thinking about the rationale for this flight and what Hess had believed and what caused him to do this in the first place is because you excellently pointed out that he was, losing ground, losing influence in the Nazi Party hierarchy. He was kind of more and more on the outs. He wasn't really involved in any major decision making after 1939, really. And so there's also another aspect to throw in here as well that may play some degree of importance later on in this alternate timeline. And that is that Hess was very likely, we know this just from like a physiological health perspective. Hess was becoming more and more mentally disturbed, schizophrenic, had these delusions of grandeur, whatever. And it's actually speculated that part of why he made this flight was because he wanted to get back into the good graces of Hitler and deliver a wonderful, great big peace deal on a silver platter and say, hey, I fixed your Western Front problems for you. Now we're good to go on the Eastern Front, which, keep in mind, Hess was influential in the drafting of Mein Kampf. He was this whole idea in Nazi ideology of taking a war to the East to defeat, Nazism's mortal enemy, communism. That was Hess's brainchild. That was his creation. And while they were hanging out in prison, Hitler was like, hey, that's a great idea. I'm going to put that in my script. So this whole idea of what we know as in our timeline, what's become known as Operation Barbarossa, a lot of that you could probably credit the original idea to Hess. Now, the actual operational planning and how this actually was going to pan out, I don't think you can really put any of that in Hess's as being Hess's brainchild. But this being introduced as a part of the ideology was definitely his original idea. So, in the early stages of the war, there had been some attempts by some intermediaries, I can English today, to make a deal with the British. Hitler wanted to get the Western Front taken care of, get the British to the negotiating table, get them to become neutral somehow. But of course, once Halifax said, nope, I'm not going to take the premiership, and Winston Churchill took the premiership in Great Britain, Winston Churchill was never going to make that deal with the Nazis. So those opportunities had dried up. So And the reason why the Duke of Hamilton, whether that's one person or the other, came up as a possible negotiator is because one of Hess's friends, Albrecht Haushofer, he had met this Duke in Berlin some point before the war and had believed that the Duke of Hamilton might still be open to this negotiation. So if Hess's flight is intercepted, and Chris, I'll throw it to you in a second because we kind of toyed around with some different ideas of how this may happen. But if Hess's flight is prevented and intercepted, I think one of the biggest things that did happen in our timeline was this being like on the front page of the New York Post and them making some sort of funny pun or joke about it in tabloid, in true tabloid fashion.
Because he was captured and like everybody knows what he's trying to do, and it becomes like it's almost Onion-esque.
Exactly.
It sounds a little bit like the Onion.
This is one of the craziest things that happened during World War II. And it's hard to believe that it actually happened, but it did. Like in our timeline, you have the third in command of the Nazi Reich basically crash landing in Scotland, hoping to make a deal of some sort. Like the Onion headlines don't write themselves. Or they do write themselves here in this instance. But I think in this alternate timeline, it's something that, a Nazi totalitarian regime is going to very much be able to put the clamp on. Nobody outside of Germany probably knows that this happened or took place. Chris, do you want to throw around some ideas there? Oh,
yeah.
Go ahead, Kai.
No.
When I was talking about this with Evan, just to kind of give you an idea of how crazy this was, without getting political, we'll say this is like Dick Cheney flying into Iraq to negotiate with Saddam Hussein. This is like Joe Biden flying into wherever Mosul to negotiate with ISIS. This is like J.D. Vance flying into whatever
Marco
Hamas is
Rubio going to Tehran. It's like kind of one of those, very high government official just deciding to parachute in.
This is an act of war. Like whatever all these other examples we're using, no.
Right.
But what I thought about was this. If the Nazis, by the way, Hess is already kind of a problem. They already recognize he's a little out there. Think about like the Night of the Long Knives. There's a way that the Nazis have to deal with people who become a problem for them. And what I suggested was they let him do it on half full gas tanks. He doesn't realize that he takes off. If you look at the interesting history of like aviation in World War II, the commander of the Polish army died in a mysterious air crash, and there's a ton of suggestions around that. One of the reasons that all of the big three meetings are either in the Soviet Union or in territories that are contiguous to the Soviet Union is because Stalin would not fly. Because bad things like... You ever heard of a guy named Yevgeny Prigozhin who mounted the coup?
I was thinking about that.
Like 2 months later, his plane crashed.
Mysteriously crashed.
Yeah, everybody saw that coming. So one of those things happens to Hess, and one, because he just drops into the North Sea, he is not captured in Britain and interrogated, and they see everything that's going on. Instead, what I suggested is the Nazis know what happened. They don't say what happened. They basically say he died a hero's death and is remembered very well, and use this as a moment to commemorate his heroic sacrifice for the fatherland on a, mission over Great Britain.
Yeah, I think that lines up very well with, what the official propagandist modus operandi was at that point. And it would have been a way for them to clamp down on embarrassment, dissent, anything. I don't think anybody would really ask a second question about, well, wait, why is the third in command of the Reich, ostensibly? Of course, the hierarchy knows that he's not really all that powerful or influential anymore. But the German public and, anybody who watches the news, they're just going to see this as a little, blip on the headline radar of, Hess dies in a plane crash in the North Sea, and business as usual resumes pretty quickly after this point. So it's more of a nothing burger in this alternate timeline on the public face, because in our timeline, of course, it becomes a big deal. So I think that makes a lot of sense and would lead to some interesting implications because of what's going on around this point in time. Because as I've made reference to previously, Operation Barbarossa in our timeline is right around the corner. This incident in our timeline happens May 10th, 1941. The operation is launched June 22nd, I believe, 1941. So we're basically talking, a couple months and change down the line, or a month and a half almost, I would say, we have this invasion of Russia happening. Now, as we discussed in the pre-podcast, gentlemen, I don't think that this one event is going to necessarily totally alter or accelerate, this operation. But I do think there's an interesting possibility that having a shutdown, silenced Hess in one form or another could lead to some strategic rethinking of things. And it might, in fact, delay the operation. You two want to pick up that thread?
So what I'll say is that one thing that I think we should establish early on and just get it out of the way is that we're going to, in this episode, and we talked about this in the pre-podcast to establish this, we're going to assume that the official narrative about the Nazis and Hitler's knowledge of this operation is true. So the Nazi, when this whole thing ended and the smoke cleared and there was an understanding of what happened, the official narrative was that Rudolf Hess was a paranoid schizophrenic. He was acting against the wills of the administration. He was completely out of line and he was crazy. And it was embarrassing and it was humiliating and the Nazis knew nothing about it. I want to pay homage to the fact that that is not necessarily believed by everyone. There are some people who believe that Hitler knew all of this all along and was hoping that it would work out. There are people who are saying this was a way for him to get rid of Rudolf Hess. There's a whole bunch of speculation as to what the Nazis knew, but we're going to go with the official timeline and say that the Nazis really were supremely embarrassed by this. This is a diplomatic embarrassment on their part, and one of the reasons why, if that narrative is to be believed, one of the reasons why Barbarossa happened in the way that it did in the canonical timeline is because the Nazis were so embarrassed that they wanted to get some sort of victory to kind of reclaim the initiative, to show that, hey, look, we're still a competent fighting force. Yes, our deputy chancellor crashed in Scotland and was ignored by everybody. That's super embarrassing. But look, we can still kick in the door in the Soviet Union. We're still on top of things. We're still capable. If Hess's flight does not happen, I suspect it may be possible that the exact happenings of Operation Barbarossa are altered such that the Nazis exercise more caution, be that in the form of a delay, be that in the form of operational differences. I think that's what we can chew on here. Operation Barbarossa, I think, still happens, regardless of what happens with Hess. But if the Hess flight doesn't happen and there's no embarrassment, I think we can chew on the possibility that the operational happenings are altered.
Yeah, I definitely think that that's very much in line with where I was thinking this was possibly going to go, because you have to keep in mind a major, an operation on the scale of Barbarossa has been in the works for months and months and months. A lot of logistics, all of this is going on, war games, war planning. So this one incident isn't going to overnight change everything. I think in terms of the the internal, because the optics are, everything's fine, everything's clear, everything's fine and dandy on the outside. Internally, the Nazi leadership is, I think, a bit shaken by this. And they take a step back, I think is their response to this, because one of the main reasons for Barbarossa is they want to stop a two-front war, as they're desperate in stopping a two-front war. They don't want Britain in the fight anymore. Churchill is not going to, once Churchill's in town, he's not going to surrender in the way that they want. They want to negotiate. Churchill's not going to do that. So Chris presented something really interesting that I'll, foreshadow here and let him really get into the details on, that I think is going to be an interesting shift in the Nazis' approach as a result of this. I think this is going to shake them a little bit, make them maybe recalculate some things, rethink some of their strategy and war planning. And they're going to realize that we need, because, Hitler and the Wehrmacht, basically the top Prussian, old school military brass of the army, they kind of are at loggerheads, in certain strategic points here and there. And the Wehrmacht knows that, Germany needs industrial production, they need oil, they need a lot of things, big industrial capacity pretty badly. And they know that it's basically a ticking clock for them to strike the Soviets when they want to on their terms. Because, they just got embarrassed in the Winter War against the Finns. But they also know that the Soviets are still a fairly decently capable force. Even after the purges in 37 and 39, the Soviets are going to recover at a certain point. So if they want their war, they're going to have to do it at some point. But there's also a lot of logistics that need to be thought of and put into play. So, Zhukov and the Soviets defeating the Japanese in 1939 in Manchuria, the Mongolia-Manchuria border, this was something that really disturbed Hitler. So Chris, how about you take it from here in terms of what we talked about with where we think this is going to divert the Nazis' war planning efforts?
Sure. So I think what we had talked previously, yes, Barbarossa was planned very well planned. And it actually was already off schedule when Hess's flight took place, because what had wound up happening, and I think based on our previous discussion, we'll get into this a lot more. Alliances at this point don't work like NATO, and people go to war without telling it their allies that are going to get dragged into this. And what happened in this case is Italy, who is allied to Germany, wound up declaring war on Greece and invading Greece.
Because Mussolini just can't get away from the idea of becoming the next Roman Empire.
And the really weird thing is, some people say this is because Hitler didn't tell him about invading Poland, so I'm going to get back at Hitler by invading Greece on my own without talking to him, which is fine if you win. But if you lose and need Hitler to come pick you up and save you, it turns into a bad thing.
It's almost like getting back as a, petty fascist dictator thing. It doesn't really necessarily work out super well for you.
Yeah. So basically what wound up happening in this case is Germany has to already put off the entire Operation Barbarossa to invade, at this point, Yugoslavia and go into Greece to pull Mussolini's pancetta out of the fire. So it's already delayed. And the reason that's important, and we talked about it a little bit, people always think that, the Russian winter is what you're fighting. What you're also fighting is something called the Rasputina, and that's the rainy season. If you're going to, people always talk about, look at Napoleon. Why did Hitler think he was better than Napoleon? Because he thought he could move faster. He could get to Moscow faster before both the rainy, muddy season when you can't move, or the winter where you can't go outside without your face hurting. And this was already, all of this time scale was already thrown off. So what we're discussing is looking at this and saying, listen, taking a step back. We've already got troops committed to the Balkans. We already have, Rommel's already in North Africa. We're already fighting there. And we're at war with the British. We are still at war with the British. Why don't we try and settle that? Why don't we just focus on that? Listen, Russia's not going anywhere. They're still going to be there next year when we can actually launch when we initially want, kind of when the thaw happens in kind of April, early May, instead of getting diverted. So what you would see is instead of, going into, and they actually did supply some arms and equipment to uprisings in Iraq in August 1941. So what if they actually take it a little bit more seriously and divert and try and, instead of going after, the United Kingdom, going after the British Empire?
And I think this makes a lot of sense because in terms of what happened, the Germans tried to, bomb the ever-living daylights out of Britain and force them to capitulate and surrender right then and there. And unfortunately for them, not only did the Royal Air Force prove to be an incredibly competent, defense, and Churchill was in there basically saying, you can take London over my dead body. Like quite literally, you can go back and see some of his speeches and some of what he said. That's basically what his attitude was, hey, we will be fighting until the last man. That was his attitude. So Hitler could be like, okay, let's take a step back. We're not going to be able to put all these resources and just, blitzkrieg and plow through from our side of Poland onto the Soviet Union. Let's try and fight the British in a different area, which has a lot of geopolitical strategic advantage to us. Keep in mind, the battle in Crete is happening 9 days later after this, on May 20th. So we're already in the neighborhood. We're in the Mediterranean theater. We're just relatively, comparatively, geopolitically speaking, a stone throws away from this area already. Why don't we just divert some resources there, help out Rommel, and we're still fighting the British, just distracting them in a different theater on our own terms. Not to mention, we have friendly forces that we can prop up in Iraq, and we have a Shah that, as we've noted in a prior episode, I believe this was in the what was the name of the guy in Spain?
Senhoro.
Senhoro. In the Senhoro episodes, we noted that Iran became Iran because it used to be called Persia, because the Shah was literally trying to signify that his country was the land of the Aryans. That's why Iran is called Iran. So we have friendly regimes in the Middle East. We have British people that we can still shoot guns at. And we can possibly get a hugely geopolitically, strategically important Suez Canal. We get all this oil. I think it's a very likely possibility that this happens because this is enough of a gut check, enough of a reality check to where, and really the plan starts formulating in a little bit of a different way. Because remember, central still to Nazi ideology is this idea of an ultimate battle against communism. But it doesn't have to happen on a battlefield and on the playing terms that would most likely benefit the Soviets in the end. Instead, it can be maybe about a year later, a few months later, and coming from a different area, a different angle, coming from the South. And this is something that we discussed pretty extensively in the pre-podcast as something that would be a much, as a result of this flight being intercepted and them rethinking their strategic battle plans, this is something that could, end up happening in the long run.
I agree. And let's not forget that in the canonical timeline, right, there's really not much pressure to invade the Soviet Union, at least in terms of the Soviet Union aggressing upon Germany. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is signed in I believe August of 1939. Right, Stalin, just to add another quiver or another bow of evil to his quiver, is actually a big admirer of Adolf Hitler. He quite likes Adolf Hitler and admires him for his, Hitler does not share an admiration for Stalin, but Stalin admires Hitler and is very open to this sort of treaty between Germany and Russia. And so Hitler does not have a pressing invasion, a Red Army just waiting to invade Germany. So in that sense, there's no real pressure to go to war with Russia. As Evan and Chris noted, the reason why this has to happen is because Hitler has an ideological opposition to communism and therefore sees this as the final triumph of Germany against Soviet and Red Army and Jewish and all of those things. He sees this as the final triumph of Germany over those corrupt elements that he perceives as being.
And this is the time to do it. The Soviets got,
in his mind.
In his mind, it's their time to do it because, the Winter War just happened, the purges have happened, so a lot of the top brass military leadership is gone. The Soviets are arguably at their weakest point in a long time around this stage. So that's why in our timeline it happened. In this alternate timeline, we can take a little bit of a, from their point of view, they can take a little bit of a step back.
Well, I think we can consider the canonical timeline with the fact that the Soviets are not, about to invade Germany. And even within the Wehrmacht, there is opposition at the highest echelons against this operation, right? We have Halder, we have Beck, we have the main one, I forget his, Rundstedt, Gerhard von Rundstedt. All of these people are voicing opposition to this operation. And they're saying, this is not the time. We shouldn't do this. This is a bad idea for XYZ reasons. And Hitler is considering it, but ultimately the ideological motivations triumph. What we can consider is that if this Hess flight doesn't take place and the embarrassment and the desire to, make amends for this diplomatic crisis are not there, that's the tipping point that said that persuades Hitler to listen to the experienced voices in the Wehrmacht and to acknowledge the fact that there's no imminent Soviet invasion on his radar. So he might as well focus on the British, which are actively opposing him, right? We can view this Hess landing as like the tipping point, so to speak. There's no embarrassment, there's no humiliation, and he still has hopes that he might be able to bring the British to the table, right? Because when Hess lands and the British ignore him, that's kind of like game over, right? It's not going to happen. Maybe there's still hope that if he presses harder and he puts the British into backs them further and further into the corner, he might be able to bring them to the table. So let's postpone. And then Gerhard von Rundstedt and all the high German officers would probably be very amenable to that. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I think, just kind of pushing along the timeline a little bit, because I definitely think that that's a possibility. What was going through my head is just, and really the issue I think that I have in approaching this episode from a top level perspective is really just kind of trying to get a grasp as to how much in our timeline the Hess flight and the embarrassment pushed things along. Because, as Chris noted, Barbarossa was already kind of delayed from their own internal timeline. So when I, did my research on this topic, my understanding has kind of always been this might have been maybe a small part of it, and maybe, the outcry and the embarrassment maybe did end up having them want to get a win. But in the grand scheme of things, this is why I kind of set up earlier in the episode, this is a lot of materiel and men and strategic planning that had to go into this already. So I think this is kind of more something that we maybe see more of the impact of in the alternate timeline than I think we do in our current time, in the actual timeline, because this thing really just kind of, after the German public is kind of, ticked off a little bit, and Goebbels actually writes in his diary, the main, Nazi propagandist, he's like, hey, the German people kind of want to know why the third in command thought this was a good idea. He was worried about this, in his own private diary, but it ended up kind of just fizzling out in the end. And the German public and really most everybody just kind of accepted the official narrative in the end. So I think more so in the alternate timeline, we're going to see the impact of that in their terms of their strategic planning. And if we launch these operations, if the Nazis launch these operations in the Middle East, I think they stand a pretty good chance of success, because they're able to reroute their, more limited resources towards areas that are not as well enforced. And Hess, in particular, even though he's a non-entity now, he's out of the picture. One thing that is interesting about his background is, where does he come from originally? He comes from British Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
So Hitler just takes a page, his parting gift, I guess you can say, Hess's parting gift in going a little bit crazy and going down in the North Sea is Hitler recognizes, hey, you know what? Even though this guy was kind of becoming a problem, that reminds me of something. Where was that guy originally from? Oh, yeah, Egypt. Duh.
The other thing is, this is something that Hitler loved to do. If you look at when he clashes with his military, it's when he says, just do it. Just do something quickly. There was a maxim of, a poor plan executed tomorrow is better than a perfect plan executed 3 weeks from now. One of the things he's always trying to do is, for example, thinking about the invasion of France. They come up with, it's basically the Schlieffen plan again. He says, no. Completely change all of your plans. And he does this like a month before the invasion. The entire, the landing on Crete that we just talked about, he basically said, no. Put a bunch of people on some planes, drop them over there, and just, let them have some fun.
There's nothing that
hit them hard.
enough coked up German soldiers can't fix in Hitler's mind. And you think I'm joking about that? No, like, go into and look into on your own time, all of the, the drugs, the coke, whatever it is that the Nazi soldiers were on. You want to understand why Blitzkrieg was effective as it was. It's because a good majority of them were strung out on drugs.
And so, it's very likely that he just would have come in and said, no. We're not doing this well laid out plan we've done we're going to do that later. Now drop some people on Cyprus.
Yeah, exactly. Drop some people in Cyprus, drop some people in Egypt, and just see how it goes. Because it's our battle plans, this sort of, adventurism has worked out pretty well for us so far. And I also think that we could take this concept of, because Hitler could realize, look, trying this well thought out approach, this calculated, methodical approach, and trying to bomb Britain and bring them to their knees, bring them to heel, didn't exactly go the way I want. So let's just go back to let's just go back to my old drawing board and keep doing what was working before. I don't know. I think that could be something that could be going through his mind as well.
Yeah. So basically what we're saying is that in our timeline, we're going to have the operation proceed, but it's going to be modified in terms of the targets, in terms of the execution, to have them to be more measured in its overall approach. Is that the timeline that we're going with?
I think, yeah, let's say delay it by roughly a year or so. So instead of, June 1941, we have this taking place in May 1942, roughly, after, they have a good amount of shoring up of resources in the Middle East. Because like I mentioned before, this is not as well defended. This is not as much of a big focal point of the war yet. So this would be a good strategic move on the Germans' part. And they would probably be able to get a lot of, material that they would need to fund their war effort against the Red Army, just coming up from the south instead of the west. Mm-hmm. So Operation Barbarossa happens, 10, 11, 12 months later, but we are instead launching strikes from, Cyprus, Egypt, Baku, or towards Baku and taking Baku, I would say, in that sort of sense. Kai, you had something that you mentioned in the pre-podcast that I also want you to throw in here as well, which I think is interesting to think about. But this, you can describe it a little better than I can, because it's your idea. So I want you to do it. Yeah. But you talked about this idea of how Operation Barbarossa was originally probably going to be more focused on strategic acquisitions instead of what it ended up playing out in our timeline.
Yeah, so actually, one of the things you don't get to say very often and don't want to say very often is, to Hitler's credit, he was actually a early on he was fixated on these strategic targets that you actually bring up, like the oil fields in the Caucasus was a big thing. One of the instrumental factors playing a role in Germany's demise, their ultimate demise, was the fact that they did not have secure lines of oil to supply to their armies and to their tanks and to their they were not able to do this, and they were not able to get this supply. So Hitler was very focused on taking the oil fields, and there was actually a one of the strategic blunders was there was a split, with some people wanting to focus on emblematic targets like Stalingrad, Moscow, kick the door in, take over those strategic places, and the whole edifice collapses. I think Hitler even said something to that effect at some point about how all you have to do is kick the door in and the whole edifice comes crashing down, referring to the Soviet Union. However, operationally, when it actually came time to do this, he was initially very focused on targets like the Caucasus oil fields, because he wanted the resources there. In the end, it ended up being kind of a 50-50 split, which is, you go for both, you get none. And he ended up splitting the armies, and we ended up having a situation where nothing ends up getting done. And indeed, the Red Army is able to regroup and push back. I wonder if in our timeline, there might be a convergence and an agreement that we need to focus on these strategic targets so that we remove these resources from the Soviets' arsenal, put them in our arsenal, and instead of focusing on these high value emblematic targets, we instead focus on isolating the USSR from their resources.
Right, which
That
I
might
think
have
would
made
be
things play out differently.
I think that would make things play out differently. And here's another huge reason as well. In our timeline, a big reason why Operation Barbarossa was not going to work as well as they had envisioned is because of in precisely because of their ideology going into this conflict. Their ideology was, hey, we are pushing out these racially inferior people, and we're going to do it as, whatever we can to do this as a projected show of power. We're going to take all this over. And these people who they could have been inclined to support the Germans if they, projected themselves as, hey, Stalin is a pretty bad guy. He's pretty terrible. He did some crappy things in Ukraine, like kill 30 million people with famines. We're here to liberate you. We're here to free you from that bad guy. Well, Hitler didn't care about that at all. And he just saw everybody that was east of Poland as racially inferior. So as a result, when the Nazis rolled in to the Soviet-held territories, the reaction of those people were, wow, Stalin's not a great guy, but the Nazis are many magnitudes of order worse. We're going to sign up and join the Red Army. And in fact, you can read accounts of this, of when there was this news, advance notice of the Nazis are going to come into this village or this town, whatever. Many times the peasants would just burn it all. They would burn their homes, burn the town, burn the farms, scorched earth policies, because they hated the Nazis so much. They knew how terrible they were, that they're like, no, we're not going to leave them anything to work with. We're just going to burn it all. And they can, hey, have a charred piece of earth. Congratulations.
Yeah.
That was basically their attitude. So I think a big reason why this modified Barbarossa is going to succeed in this alternate timeline, go better for the Germans, is because they are not having to deal with people that they view as racially inferior. Hitler had and this is a little interesting, you can chase this woodland creature, this rabbit hole, later in our own research if we want to, but Hitler had a professed interest in Islam because of ideological similarities and hatred against the Jews. And he basically, there were two main people groups, actually, I think three, that Hitler basically gave honorary Aryan status to. The Japanese, because they're best friends with them in the Axis. American Indians, which that's a very interesting, again, another rabbit hole to dive down into in another timeline, another time. And Arabs. Hitler basically, because of, again, ideological similarities. So if you are rolling in to these territories that the British hold and, France formerly held, that's another thing I don't think we mentioned as well, is Vichy France has a toehold in the area already with Syria. So that really expedites things, I would say, for this new Barbarossa. It's not Barbarossa campaign yet, but it will become Barbarossa after, the Middle East is taken care of. So you're not having to subjugate these people, and you're not having to commit, these mass murders and rapes and pillagings and all that happen in the Soviets in our timeline. Instead, you basically come in and say, hey, we're freeing you from these colonial British overlords, and we would like some of your oil, please. And the locals in the area would just be like, hey, we agree with you guys ideologically. We like what you say about the Jews because we hate them too. Take our stuff. Go ahead and do it. So I think that's a huge reason why this is going to be more successful for
just
the
as a
Germans.
point. Now, we did discuss Barbarossa still happens later. They still
Yes.
behave the exact same way there.
Yes. But having this, I called it in the pre-podcast a different kind of Southern strategy. Completely different context, I think would initially and strategically be a lot more beneficial in the alternate timeline.
Yeah,
So
I think that's a good point. And I think that it's the brutality of the Nazis really came into being during Operation Barbarossa.
I mean, not that it already wasn't before that point, let's be real. But
no. But
I know what you're saying, but like
accelerated.
the acceleration of it and it just being really seen on a hugely broad scale.
Correct. Yes.
Yeah.
Because Operation Barbarossa was pitched as a racial war, as a final war, as a total war, right? It was the end all be all. And so if we have prior operations setting the Nazis up without the degree of brutality, right? Because we're not in the total war yet. This is just the setup for the total war. So we don't have to be monsters, right? We don't have to be as big of monsters right now. We can wait. Then that potentially sets them up to be in a much better position where they're not just pillaging everybody, but instead they've set themselves up, they've built up local ties, and now when the time comes in 1942 in our timeline to invade the Soviet Union, they have a much firmer base of support from which to launch the operation. And now this is the total war, and of course the brutality is still going to come out, it's still going to be horrific, millions are still going to die, but it's going to be delayed, and that's going to leave Germany in a much better position operationally.
I think it leaves them in a much stronger position.
Is that what we're chewing on?
I think, yes. I think you've summarized it pretty well. I do think there's a big monkey wrench that we need to throw in here in terms of planning and timelines and everything that I think is ultimately, because up until this point, dear listeners, if you've listened to all of this, you're probably thinking, okay, so Germany has a big advantage now because they have a lot of holdings in the Middle East, a lot of oil. Does this change the outcome of World War II at all? I'm just going to say, from my humble opinion, and I'm pretty sure from what the pre-podcast discussion was saying, my co-hosts would agree with this. No, I don't think this changes the outcome of World War II at all, because there's still one major event that we haven't discussed yet that is not affected by this at first blush. I think Chris Capello might have something to say about it, but I think in the end, it's really not going to matter as much. And that is what happened in December of 1941. It is the day that shall live in infamy. The Japanese launch a strike on Pearl Harbor. That is not changed here because the Japanese, like Chris said earlier in the episode, this is still at a point in time, unlike NATO, where your allies can just launch an attack on somebody else and they don't tell their other allies, and they're expected to help kind of pick up the pieces if things go wrong. So in this timeline, we have Germany instead going towards the more Middle Eastern theater. But by December, Pearl Harbor still happens. And the rationale for Germany declaring war on the United States is not changed.
What rationale there is.
Whatever rationale there is, which, as we discussed extensively in the pre-podcast, was very minimal and not very well thought out. But Chris, do you want to? I think it's good to throw it to you, unless Kai, you wanted to say something.
No, toss it to Chris.
Yeah, Chris, I do think there was something interesting you talked about being a potential difference as a result of this alternate timeline that might affect things.
Yeah.
But Pearl Harbor, why don't you go into that?
Basically, one of the only, one of the reasons, one of the only reasons, and I think this might be the theme of this episode of guessing what's going on because there's not a whole lot of evidence. One of the guesses about why Nazi Germany declared war on the United States after Pearl Harbor is kind of what we were talking about earlier. Well, if we declare war on the United States and Japan's fighting them, then Japan will declare war on the Soviet Union because we're fighting them. If that's not going on, because in our timeline, Barbarossa has been put off for 1 year. Germany's not at war with the Soviet Union. Soviet Union's completely out of this. So the question is, why? Keep in mind, Japan's been at war with China for 4 years now. Nobody saw any reason to do anything to nationalist China. So I think if you don't have Barbarossa going on at this point, one, maybe Germany doesn't see the need to, and number two, maybe Germany actually dots some I's and crosses some T's and puts some umlauts on some things and make sure that Japan has committed to come in against the Soviets when they do.
Yeah. I do think that's a really interesting idea. As we discussed in the pre-podcast, though, I do think, quite frankly, Hitler basically knee-jerk reacted in our timeline when he basically was like, okay, Japan, our ally, got into the war against the United States, so I'm going to be a good ally and jump in alongside with them. I don't think it was really something that he thought out super well at all. So while I do like that idea as a possibility because the Soviets aren't in the war yet, quite frankly, with how ill-conceived the declaration was in our timeline to begin with, I think if you only remove the Soviet geopolitical consideration as one element of it, I still think the shock and awe and the surprise of what happened with the Japanese declaring war would probably have still weighed more heavily in their mind. I mean, let's also not forget that the Germans are not going to have been dealing with a Operation Barbarossa that initially had seen some success, but was kind of starting to turn against them at this point with the winter. They're not going to be looking for another area to, get themselves involved with, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So
yes. So one thing that we also talked about in the pre-podcast was Hitler's decision was irrational to declare war on the U.S. I think we can all agree with that. I think everybody in the world would agree with that. It was an irrational decision made kind of on the spot and ridiculous. However, one additional nugget was that Lend-Lease is going on at this time. The U.S. is making massive shipments to the U.K. of supplies. And so we can call it casus belli, or we can say that this might have been going on in Hitler's mind, is the U.S. is being sneaky. They're saying, hey, you can't attack us. We're not at war with you. We're just supplying ungodly amounts of supplies to your enemy, but you can't attack us. Hitler might be thinking, hey, if I declare war, now I can attack them and I can stop Lend-Lease. It's still absolutely inconceivable, and it's still an utterly awful idea to do because now you're just making the U.S. want to supply Britain even more and indeed getting them involved in the conflict themselves. It's still totally outlandish, but that might be one reason among many why Hitler felt it was necessary to declare war. And I just want to throw that out there. The second thing I want to throw out is answering your question, Evan, about does our timeline meaningfully impact the ultimate outcome of the war? And I think Chris's additional comments notwithstanding, because I think if you take into consideration what Chris is saying, I think it does change the outcome of the war. If indeed Hitler does not declare war on the U.S., I think the outcome changes. But I still agree with you, Evan, that Hitler would declare war because it was an irrational decision. Changes in the circumstances are not going to change an irrational decision if it's made irrationally. And provided that Hitler does still declare war on the United States in our timeline, I don't think there's a difference in the ultimate outcome. I still think Germany loses, and we could say maybe it's not total surrender. Maybe the Allies accept something short of total surrender, but in the end, Germany loses.
That's actually something I wanted to delve into a little bit. And I do think, with how much time we spent on this episode, we can start drawing things to a close a little bit. But I do think, and this is something I had not thought about, in my show notes or in the pre-podcast at all. So we're starting to go into uncharted territory here. So buckle your seatbelts. But I think really the main change I can see from this, because outcome-wise, I think Germany still loses the war. But in terms of, I think, the post-war settlement, and in terms of what happens, in terms of the areas that get brought into the Iron Curtain in our timeline, most of Eastern Europe. Well, first of all, if there is no Soviet involvement, at this point in World War II, America just gets brought in, most of what happens and pans out in our timeline pans out, but the Soviets aren't necessarily coming in or invading from the East. Or if we are assuming that, Hitler is able to, have a much better and much more successful Operation Barbarossa coming up from the South, the Soviets are mega not an entity at all. But be that as it may, let's just assume for one reason or another, the Soviets aren't really involved in the post-war settlement at all. And the Eastern European areas that in our timeline were, razed and pillaged and burned and all that kind of stuff, if that does not happen or does not happen as much in this timeline, because more of the focus is on the South, I think that has a very interesting implication and change on how, the Cold War pans out. Is there even a Cold War if there aren't really any Soviets or major Soviet influence to begin with? Now, Chris, I know you mentioned earlier in this episode that we are still assuming that Operation Barbarossa happens like the same way that it does in our timeline. So if that's the case, then a lot of what I just speculated would probably be moot. But I do think,
two things about it.
Yeah, I'll let you opine on that.
One is, where is that lie? Because that is an important point. If it is a year later, where is that lie?
Yeah.
And I'm going to do what I always do and throw something else. Throw a giant bomb into
Drop the bomb. Do it.
I literally am.
But, I mean, we're already talking about World War II and dropping big bombs, so we might as well just
I haven't
drop
done
another
it yet.
one.
You've already dropped one. You just got to drop one more.
No. You know exactly which one I'm doing. I'm talking about that one.
Oh, of course.
Because if the Soviet Union, if Barbarossa is put off a year, that means the Manhattan Project is successful and delivers a device that can be dropped on Germany before Germany surrenders.
And would have been in this scenario if Germany was
nobody would have bat an eyelash.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Which is part of my calculus going into suggesting that in our timeline, ultimately the outcome of the war is not the same. Now I would be very happy ruminating on the topic of whether victory is different, but victory for the Allied powers, I think, is out of the question, is totally guaranteed because of the Manhattan Project in part, and also because I feel that Russia and Germany would, as they did in the canonical timeline, fight themselves into extinction. In the canonical timeline, Russia and Germany basically fight themselves to extinction. The Allies breaking into Normandy and opening a Western front means that Germany deteriorates faster, and as a result, the Soviet Union can recuperate. In our timeline, that doesn't happen. The Soviets and the Germans fight themselves into extinction, right? The U.S. basically ends things with a nuke, and the Russians are basically in shambles. Germany's defeated. Ultimately, victory still goes through.
There's no East or West Berlin if there's no Berlin to speak of.
Yeah, right. Exactly. So I'm willing to ruminate on the idea of maybe the Allies settle for something less than total surrender, but in the end, if they have the bomb, right, Germany's fate is the same as Japan's. ultimately.
Well, I mean, and that's something that, and if we did want to do a part 2 on this, we could think about this. But I think at the tail end of this episode, we can also throw this out as well. Is Germany going to respond to the threat of a bomb the same way that Japan does? My first initial blush and first initial reaction is no, because as much as we want to paint Hitler as irrational, and he was in a lot of ways, especially towards the end of the war, in our timeline, what was a big reason for that happening? It's because the Americans and the French and the British are coming from the West, and the Soviets are coming from the East. He is hunkered down in his bunker in Berlin, knowing full well that it's a game of who's going to execute him first. Is it going to be the Russians or is it going to be the Allies? So that's why he makes his decision. In this timeline, he faces all of the heat and all the pressure pretty much solely from the West. And Nazi ideology is also not the same as Japanese ideology when it comes to this idea of, the Japanese were going to, they had the kamikazes, they had all of these, and this idea of Emperor Hirohito being from God, a god, all these kinds of things. And Japan was not going to surrender, in any circumstance, no matter how hopeless the situation was. And that's why a lot of people have this argument about this, but the generally accepted historical interpretation was Truman dropped the bombs because Japan was never going to surrender otherwise. I don't know if that same mentality can be applied to the Germans.
Here's the thing, and
No,
this kind of
it
interestingly
cannot.
gets back to kind of the beginning of this episode, which is, despite what people think about Germans being very ordered, the entire Nazi system was such mean girl high school that it's kind of hard to fathom.
The degree of cognitive dissonance between Nazi ideology and how they actually executed things is crazy.
And so
it's
I'm
wild.
thinking about this in terms of what actually happened when Hitler killed himself. Hermann Goering, who's kind of number 2, has already stepped up and said, while you're unable to practice in Berlin, I'm going to take over. Hitler hears about that and says, no, you're not. You are now nobody. You are now just as likely to be killed by German troops as anybody else's. And he just randomly, for some reason, picks Karl Dönitz, the leader of the German Navy, as his successor. What I'm saying is this: in our timeline, if there was a bomb on Berlin, A, he's gone. B, the deputy Fuhrer is at the bottom of the North Sea right now. They never announced anybody to replace him, even when he was sitting in a British prison. So, who surrenders? What happens?
Right.
There is not a successor.
Well, and I mean, that's what I'm kind of trying to think through as we draw things to a close here is, man, this is why I posited the question is, would the bomb dropping on Germany be a necessity to begin with? Are they going to respond the same way as the Japanese did, which is, heck no, we're never surrendering no matter how bad things get? To me, as irrational as, Hitler and the Nazi, party and the Nazi leadership were, I also know that, a lot of what drew them into this whole conflict and war to begin with was this aggrievement and this sense of you have wronged Germany. You have, World War I, the outcome of World War I, the Versailles Treaty, all of that, the Jews, the international cabal, all conspiring against us. That's what made this a necessity to start with. If we have that mentality and Hitler and the Wehrmacht realize the game's up, we're going to lose this war. They got the ultimate weapon. They got the bomb. Let's negotiate and sue and settle for peace before Berlin becomes a nuclear radioactive wasteland so that we don't have a repeat of Versailles. We can have at least some sort of settlement that can help us out here, that can help out Germany to not be as bad as it was in World War I. I personally feel that is the much more likely approach.
Oh, wait.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to have. Hitler will not do it. but whoever takes over after him might.
That's what I think is that's where I'm going with this. And whether that means the bomb gets dropped and
It
everybody
does.
is vaporized, or
I disagree. I think there's a Valkyrie part 2, and I think that it succeeds.
that's where
and I
I
think
was
that
going.
someone
That's
takes
where I
over
was
Hitler.
going with this. That's where I was going with this.
So
I think there's a very strong possibility that Hitler gets taken out somehow, and whoever replaces him ends up negotiating before the bomb is dropped. But that's what I personally think.
Yeah, in our timeline where we have a Hiroshima and Nagasaki happening before German surrender, right? In that scenario, I think that
just to be clear, when you say that, you mean weapons being dropped on Japan?
correct.
Okay.
Yeah. So the atomic bomb exists, right? And so Hitler can't claim this is Jew science anymore, right? Because that was Hitler's initial claim. The atomic bomb, all of this atomic stuff is just Jew science. It's not real. We need to focus on Isaac Newton. Albert Einstein is evil. He's Jewish. He's very evil. Screw all of this. He didn't believe in that kind of stuff, even though the Nazis were still covertly trying to pursue it. He just said that's all Jew science. It's not Jew science, or maybe it is Jew science, but Jew science works, you know? The bombs exist, they're real, and they work, and they've been demonstrated to work. So now the Germans have to contend with this idea that what they were calling Jew science is actually real science, and it's actually working. What are we going to do about this? And if Hitler is sitting there, no, we're going to fight to the last man, let all these German cities get nuked, we don't care, we're going to fight. That's going to precipitate an Operation Valkyrie Part 2, and it may be someone even less savory than Hitler, like Heinrich Himmler, the SS. You know, it might be Hermann Goering, it might be somebody else, but something's going to give, because I strongly doubt that the Germans are going to sit there and tolerate the bombing of their cities when their backbone was much less, I won't put it in good terms, but they were not as ferocious as the Japanese. They were not willing to put up with the same losses that the Japanese were. They would capitulate.
That's kind of the point I was trying to get at, is I don't think the Germans are going to take the same approach that the Japanese did.
I just don't see the United States having the bomb and using it on Japan instead of Germany. If they've only got 2, one of them's going to Berlin, and the other one is going somewhere else in Germany.
Unless Germany capitulates.
After the first one.
Yeah. I don't know.
You have to demonstrate it on a city.
Yeah. I don't know. I think that's all very fascinating conjecture, and something that I think we have set up ourselves up well for a potential part 2 is, you know, bomb or no bomb, which we would settle in part 2. You know, how would a different World War II Germany look, and a really post Japan, post war Germany, everybody, if a certain third in command Nazi official, Rudolf Hess, ended up not successfully, or rather unsuccessfully, crash landing in Scotland and instead crashed in the North Sea. But anyway, guys, I think that's just about all that we can get out of this particular fork and at this time. Any last minute, things that we all want to throw out there, or other random thoughts before we draw things to a close?
Well, I think we really need to chew on the most important outcome here, which is, in our timeline, at what point does Hitler board the flight for Argentina?
No, it was a submarine. It was a submarine.
Oh, man. It is kind of interesting how, now that you bring that up, Kai, it is kind of interesting how South America just kind of becomes a dumping ground for old white racists.
Indeed.
Because, a bunch of Confederates went down to Brazil, and a bunch of Nazis went to Argentina. So I don't know. That's something that would also probably still be the same in this alternate timeline.
Indeed. Yes.
Yeah. All right. Well, anyway, guys, thank you so much for hopping on and shooting the breeze here. We ended up actually taking this, kind of in the middle of the episode. I think it was more of this might be a bit of a nothing burger, and we're stuck in the proverbial Soviet mud there for a bit. But now by the end of this, I think we kind of just really, blew this wide open, pun not intended. And things could have been very different in the end. So thanks, Kai, for the suggestion. And thank you, Chris, for joining us. And thank you, dear listeners, for tuning in. If you enjoyed this, we're on most major podcast platforms: Spotify, Apple Music, whatever you listen to, wherever you get your podcasts, we're on there. Feel free to join us on the Discord, where we kick around ideas and suggestions from our listeners. You could end up having your topic discussed, or if you're very enterprising, you can end up being a guest host on the show. But with all of that said, we can now conclude with our favorite way to end our episodes. If you happen to encounter a fork in time, what, pray tell, do you think we should do with it?
Take it.
Take it.
We're all in agreement. You should take it. Thanks for listening.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.